How's it going, everybody? Andrew Robinson here, back at it with another Max MSP tutorial. In this video, we are going to talk about the Multislider object. The Multislider object is another graphical user interface object that is super valuable, both for creating dynamic user interfaces and for, debugging and tracking data. So let's just jump right into it. First things first, as always, we're going to double click in the blank white space, type in the word Multislider, and this is what it's going to create. This is our Multislider, and by default, it's just actually one singular slider. We have these outlets here. This is the outlet that is the list value of all of the sliders, and this is the value of just a singular slider. So if we attach if we create a message box and attach our patch cord to the right inlet of both of these message boxes, you're going to see we're getting the value of this one singular slider out right here, and by default, all the way at the bottom is -1, and all the way at the top is 1. So this is a range between 1 and -1. Now, if we click on the object and then click on the inspector icon over here, we're going to open up the inspector for this object, which is what lets us change the values and the way this object works. And there's a lot that we can change here for this object, which is what makes it so super versatile. So the first thing we're going to look at is right here, this tab. If we click on the All tab under the inspectors and scroll down to where it says sliders, you see there's an option for the number of sliders, which is currently set to 1, which we've discovered, and you see an option for range, which we've also discovered is currently between -1 and 1. So let's say, we wanted 100 sliders. We could do that. We're just going to type 100 into the number of sliders, lock our patch, and then if you click on it, you can start to drag around, and we have, in fact, 100 different sliders that is now outputting 100 values. And see, I started changing some of that and moving them around, and as soon as I let go, this list output and updated. So yeah, we could set all of these down to -1, and that is 100 -1s. Or we could do what we are doing and just kind of like randomly draw in the line, and this is what each slider is at, what value it's set to. So just this right away, we have 100 sliders outputting 100 values, and we could set that to be whatever range we want. That already is really incredible for a lot of different things. Like, this is a huge list. There's so much we can control with this. And like 100 sliders almost seems unnecessarily, like, way too much. But that's awesome that we have that many to work with and can do all these things with it. If we look back at it, we could even then, change the range as we want. So rather than doing -1 to 1, let's just say, 0 to 400. And we'll type that in, click, drag around, and you see, yep, now we are getting sliders between 0 and 400. And you notice as I'm doing this, it only updates when I let go. This is another feature that we can change if we want in the inspector window, and it's probably pretty important. That is the continuous data output option right here. If you just check that on, then you can click and drag any one of these sliders, and you'll notice it'll start to update right away, right as we are moving it. That is the continuous data output in action. So both of these settings can be very valuable for a lot of different reasons. Whether you need that like update where it is continuous, or just after the change is made. Both very valuable for very different reasons, just totally depending on what you're trying to do with it. Some other fun things we can do with just the way this is set up and functions in this inspector window is this slider style option. We can change the way it looks. By default, it's set to thin line, and you notice these are, in fact, very thin lines, but we could do something like bar, and then we get a bar where it's filled in, and this might look more familiar because this actually looks more like sliders. And if we reduce the number of sliders, I'm going to just go down to 6, we'll see more so that, yes, these are now bars, and they're just drawn to the bottom. And look, now we're only getting an outdate of 6 values, so very useful, just like that. You can make these look and output however you wish. There are other options that are not as useful for dynamic interfaces, but those options are important for data tracking. If we create another multi-slider object real fast, and we turn on our continuous data output option, and we change the slider style to something like reverse point scroll, and we just patch a float number box into this inlet up top, which is going to set the slider in there. And I just start moving it around. You'll see we're now getting a kind of scrolling effect. And if I can, randomly change this between -1 and 1, you'll see that as it updates, it moves over. So if you had like a bunch of data coming in like this, just randomly, really quickly, this would be really helpful for tracking that data, because you could see where your kind of constant range is, what the values are, where it spikes, where it dips. This is it's a super helpful way for tracking data, especially if it was coming in really fast. And the other option besides reverse point scroll is reverse line scroll, which looks probably actually maybe even better depending on what you're trying to go for. And again, it's just the same thing. It's you see the spikes and you see the dips, and you could see where it goes if it drops below 0 towards -1. And again, you can control the range and the number of sliders just as well. So if you had 3 lines of data that were coming in randomly really quickly, you could have 3 of these reverse line scrolls in one singular multi-slider object. That's super useful for just tracking data and keeping an eye on what's going on. And again, there's still so much more we can set in the inspector window. There's this candy cane color option, which is just, you would click on it, you would input the number of sliders that you have. For this top one, we've got 6, and now the colors have changed to alternate. So each one is a different color, and you can then set the colors in the inspector for each individual slider. And if you didn't want that, they would all be set to the same color. So again, whatever makes sense for what you're doing. So now that we've looked at the object and how to set it up in the inspector window, we're going to just jump right into using this for today's build to show how something like this would be useful in a max patch outside of just, tracking data and all that stuff. So I think what would be the easiest thing to do is to revisit an old video where I talked about building an FM synthesizer. FM synthesis is a pretty simple and straightforward form of audio synthesis that's really fun to do, especially in Max MSP, and it's a great place to start for beginners if you're doing audio synthesis stuff. So we're going to use these sliders and the value they output to control this FM synthesis, all from just one multi-slider object, which that is super useful. But what we have to do is first we have to get each of these individual slider values out, and so we can use those to set the FM synthesis the way we want. And the easiest way to do that is to use the unpacked object, because multi-slider outputs all its values and data as a list. So if we want to unpack and get an individual value from the list, then we use the unpack object. And we're going to put 6 Fs in here. And the reason why is because we have 6 sliders and they're outputting floating point values. So that's what the F stands for, floating point value. And if we just patch the outlet of the multi-slider into the inlet of the unpack, and then if we give all of these individual floating point number boxes, which I just created by pressing the F key on my keyboard, and I then adjust this first slider, we'll see that update in that number box. And again, if we just had copies of these for all of these outlets, which you can do either by highlighting, holding down the option key and dragging, or just pressing F on your keyboard 6 times, you'll see then, yes, all of these will now output into their own individual floating point number box, which makes it very easy for us to then use these individual values to do whatever we want to do. And in this case, we're going to use them to set that FM synthesizer. So the next step to do that is we now have to take these floating point values and we have to turn them into a signal value, which is very easy. It's not an object we've really talked about, but it's called sig tilde. And that's it. All it does is whatever floating point number goes into the inlet, it returns an audio signal of that number value. So pretty easy. We're just going to attach all of these into their own sig objects so that all these floating values then become audio signals. And this will help with the FM synthesis part. The next step is kind of where things get complicated, and I think kind of where I might have made a bit of a mistake in my original video. I was doing the sound synthesis part by multiplying the sine waves that we're about to create together. And the suggestion that I've gotten on that video from a few people is to do that kind of stuff before. This, I guess, makes it more technically correct. I think part of the beauty of Max MSP is things don't necessarily have to be technically correct as long as things work and sound cool and you're happy with it. But for the sake of knowledge and learning correctly, this should be a more appropriate way of doing FM synthesis. So with that disclaimer out of the way, what we are going to do is we are going to create a new object, and it is going to be a multiply tilde object, which will allow us to multiply these audio signals together. So we're going to take these first two audio signals and we're just going to multiply them. So we will have this signal coming out and we're going to multiply it by this signal, which is going to create the basis for this FM synthesis effect. We're then going to kind of copy that, and we're going to take this signal and we're going to multiply it by this signal. So that's all nice and handy, and we're going to take this first one, and this first multiply tilde object is going to go into a cycle tilde object, which creates a sine wave. And so if we take this signal and we multiply it by this signal and connect that into our cycle, that signal, this multiplied signal, is what is now driving this first sine wave. So that is super, super important, and that is basically the fundamental theory behind an FM synthesis, is we're having one audio signal drive a sine wave, which will then drive another sine wave, if I understand things correctly. So now that we've got that set up, we're going to take this signal and we're going to multiply it by this signal. So now this sine wave is it's being controlled by this, which is going to give us a cool ring modulation effect. And if we just take that and then add it back to our original audio signal, and then use that to drive another sine wave, we will have completed the FM synthesis setup. All we got to do now is attach it to an audio DAC, but first I'm going to run it through a live.gain object so we can control the volume. I'm going to patch it into the left inlet, and we're going to create our easy DAC, which is our audio output. It's the speaker, so we can hear it through the computer speakers, and I'm going to connect that in, and then we're going to change these settings. And there you go. That is some very beautiful FM synthesis. And there's a lot we can do to make this even better or just sound different, depending totally on what you want to do. We set the range of our multislider to be between 0 and 400, which might be, the 0 to 400 might work very well for this first slider, which is setting the pitch. That's a cool sound. Yeah, the 0 to 400 might work well for this first slider, which is setting the pitch. But it might not work so well for this second slider, which you see when we have turned up really high, creates a very, very high-pitched frequency, and it's because we're multiplying this. So you can imagine that signal value is really high up there on the frequency spectrum. So that might not work as well for that one. In this case, we can then use the scale object and scale our 0 to 400 range to be something else that seems more appropriate. I don't know what that would be. I'm going to arbitrarily say between 0 and 10. Why not? So then if we just take that and we patch that into this patch cord right here, which I just did very quickly by holding down the shift key on the keyboard and sliding it in between this patch cord. You saw those circles show up. That means it's going to slide right in there. And again, you just hold down the shift key while doing that to do it really quickly. It's a very helpful shortcut. And now if we turn this back up and adjust this, we're going to have a different range of values. And that sounds way different. So maybe, you won't like that as much. And you could just mess with what these values are until you do find something you do like. I don't know, let's set this, instead of 10, let's turn it up to 50. Okay, that's a little bit better. We have that range of weirdness back, but it's not so high pitched necessarily that it's unlistenable. And with a little bit more modification and fine-tuning, we could really hone that in. But that's kind of basically what you need to know to start messing around with that on your own. So if we just honestly take all of this, I'm going to delete this. We could just take this whole section here, and I'm going to again hold down the Option key and click and drag to just copy all of it over. And then we're just going to repatch these in here. So we have now 2 different FM synthesizers. The first one is being controlled by the first 3 sliders here, and this second one is being controlled by these back 3 sliders. And if we just patch that into the right inlet of our live gain, and then take the second outlet and pass that into the right inlet of our easy DAC, we're going to now have one FM synthesizer coming out of the left speaker and the other one coming out of the right, which will be pretty cool in giving us different sounds at the same time. And again, all of this is being controlled from this singular multislider object, which all we have to do is click and drag around in to change these sounds. And that's pretty cool and very simple. I'm gonna turn that up a little bit more. And that's pretty much it. There are still some high-pitched rings in there coming from one of these. Again, you can kind of fine-tune that just by messing with the scale and adjusting that 0 to 400 range that we defined in the inspector of the multislider object to be a more appropriate range for the frequency and whatever you find. All of these could have very different ranges. That is kind of totally up to you and the sound that you want to create. But this is a pretty simple way to do that. And create things very quickly and have them change very quickly. And you know, we started by doing 100 sliders. So think about, you know, having, if these are in groups of 3s, you could have 30 FM synthesizers all controlled from one singular multi-slider object, which would just be nuts. That would be the most insane sounding thing probably I think I've ever heard. So that's super useful. And again, these are all just floating point numbers in a list that the multislider is creating. So we could use this to change so many different things. It doesn't have to be FM synthesis necessarily. We could have, like, you know, just 3 sliders and have that be like an RGB color thing. Or, you know, if you were trying to create your own lighting board because you needed to control some lights through Max MSP, you could have the first 3 sliders be the RGB, and then maybe the 4th slider be white, and the 5th slider be a strobe effect that comes on, and set the other ones to be other effects. Literally, whatever you need, you could then just create them all. And however many sliders you need, you can define that in the multi-slider object. And it's just so useful because it's all coming from one object. And I feel like this is just a very simple and quick example of how this could be used, but I cannot stress enough how valuable and versatile the multi-slider object can be. So I hope that kind of shows you, you know, some basic stuff to get started with this object. We can look real quickly at the help file to see that there's even way more ways we could, you know, define this. We could, like, for example, if we had this like set at a specific value, but we wanted to modulate one of these individually without having to click and drag it. Like if we just wanted this set, but then something like just modulating that up and down for us automatically, if we just look at the help file for the object, we can find what object lets us do that by looking at all of these messages. And there are so many messages for this object. Don't be overwhelmed by that. All of them do something very valuable. The object we're looking for is select, because it says set selected slider value, which is what we want. We want to set the slider value. And it says selectively set slider values. For example, select 130, 2, 4, 5, 50 sets the first slider to 30, the second to 40, and the 5th to 50. That totally makes sense. So if, again, we wanted to use this in our own example and modulate, say, the second slider, that would be select, that would be the message, select 2, and then whatever value we want to set it to. So if we just did select 2 and then $1 to be our variable, we know the range is between 0 and 400 because that's what we set it to be. So we're just going to create a floating point number box, attach that in there, And we'll see as we change this value, it's now changing that second slider also. So then we could automate this in a very interesting way somehow. Let's say we wanted to use like another like cycle object, because it just creates a sine wave, so that's like an up and down. We could totally do that. We'll just set it to a frequency value. We're going to then use the peak amp object to turn the signal value into a regular floating point value, attach that in there, and you'll see it is changing. It's just really small because it's a floating point value. So we're going to say scale 0 to 1 to be between 0 and 400 because that's our input range. And now you'll see, there it goes. It's modulating itself very quickly. We could probably even reduce the speed that this is happening at by just changing the cycle value. And there you go. Now that multi-slider value it's changing itself. We don't even have to click and drag in it. We could if we wanted to, but if you wanted to, create something a little bit more fancy that was doing it by itself, that's how you could get started at that. And again, it's just finding the correct the correct message to do what you need to do, and all of that can be seen in the references pane, which we can easily pull up by opening up the help file and exploring this side panel or these tabs, and everything we've talked about is in here somewhere. So with that, I hope that gives you enough of look at all the different ways this multi-slider object can be used to do a lot of cool, interesting, and fancy things very quickly, and just how it could be very useful as that kind of graphical user interface object for any number of reasons. And so with that, we've now reached the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it as always. I appreciate how much our community has grown over the years, and I really, really appreciate that you guys keep coming back and watching these videos, and we're all here learning things together. It means so much to me, so seriously, thank you. If you guys did learn anything, please remember to like and subscribe, because that's how I know you guys found this video to be helpful. And if anybody has any lingering questions or any comments, please feel free to leave that in the comment section down below. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.